What's up, guys? Your boy today is Sean Tyres, and I'm here with
Nicholas Ang,
Tanner Woodruff,
And me, Rock the Duck.
and Rockley from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who's kindly joining us.
Rock the Duck. Rock the Duck.
Thanks for joining us today for the daily program of a character's overview.
We're going to start off with our regular insight on today's topic,
We'll be taking a look into the cuckoo's nest.
comparing mental health from the 20th and 21st century.
and talking about one of Ken Kesey's books.
One who walked onto the cuckoo's boat.
No, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but good try, Ruckley.
The book was written in 1962 during a time where the words mental illness was associated with hurtful words such as evil and violent.
Ken Kesey was born September 17th, 1935, in La Junta, Colorado. He developed an interest in theater at the University of Oregon and won a graduate program in writing at Stanford University. While attending Stanford in 1960, Ken Kesey volunteered as a paid experimental subject in a study conducted by the U.S. Army in which he was given mind-altering drugs and asked to report on their effects. He also worked as an attendant in the hospital's psychiatric ward. These experiences served as the basis for his 1962 novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Perhaps it is here that he began the idea of the Merry Pranksters.
Oh, interesting.
Who are the Merry Pranksters?
Mary, a prankster? You gotta be kidding me.
No, the Merry Pranksters were a group of like-minded individuals to Casey. They set out together on a cross-country trip in an old school bus covered in kaleidoscope graffiti. The kaleidoscope was reference to their LSD trips that they often took on the bus, which Casey also wrote certain parts of the book. If you read it, it's pretty obvious while he was on drugs such as LSD.
Through the perspective of Bromden, Kesey depicts ECT as something to fear, even for someone with a Hulk-like stature. He shows that in some cases, ECT could be used as motivation for the patients to behave, kind of going over what it was like in the 1960s. In this quote, the significance is shown here. No, on second thought, it isn't completely free. You pay for the service with brain cells instead of money, and everyone has simply billions of brain cells on deposit. You won't miss a few. Page 146.
I love free moon trips.
Ken Kesey's idea of mental illness is probably influenced by the DSM-1. This actually came out in 1952 and surprisingly included differences such as homosexuality to be mental disorders. Something surprising that I also thought, I don't know about you guys, but women could actually be admitted by their husbands into asylums by their husbands because they just didn't clean enough around the house.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Many different operations were being tested at this time, and they did not all succeed. One quote that I have is they considered Ruckley one of their failures.
Yep, got an F- on my brain.
In the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Kesey shows treatments for the patients and activities that help reform the patients. Some methods he mentions in the novel are lobotomies, leucotomies, ESD or ECT, the red pill, which is used for sleep medication and a sedative, and hydrotherapy. Kesey also has Bromden mention they no longer use hydrotherapy because of the new drugs. He also makes it clear throughout the novel that they only allow the patients to do activities if it proves therapeutic value. For example, the basketball team McMurphy organizes,
Right.
the pool, the library, or in certain cases, they have the men do chores like cleaning the ward to help reform them and believe it has therapeutic benefits. Now, Nick, would you please tell the audience a bit about Kesey's depiction of the setting in the story about life on a ward?
Well, the book is set in the 1950s in a psychiatric ward in Oregon. So this is a time of oppression where, like, a lot of people don't see mental illness in the light we see it today. Like, we see how we have an educated view at how it looks like today. It's not really violent or evil.
A lot of stigma built up in the 1950s, right?
Yeah, it plays into the theme of oppression. The patients are constantly being told what to do and when to do it. For example, time is controlled by the slowing of the clock in the ward.
Right. I think that links into patient-nurse relationships that were depicted by Kesey.
Yeah, for sure.
In the story, the nurse was depicted as an evil control freak who basically hates all the patients. The main conflict actually in the story was basically between her and her patients, not the patients in the society. She cared more about making the patients suffer than actually helping them transition back into society, which was the ward's purpose. One of the quotes I got was when she was talking about McMurphy and the issues he was bringing about. She says, "We have weeks She stands up, looking more pleased with herself than I've seen her look since McMurphy came at her to trouble her a week ago. We have weeks or months or even years if need be. Keep in mind that Mr. McMurphy is committed. The length of time he spends in this hospital is entirely up to us. Now, if there's nothing else... And I think this quote's a really good representation of the nurse basically saying that it doesn't matter if we get this guy back into society. We got to break him first. We can keep him here as long as we want because that's what we can. And that, I think, represents Casey's representation really well of the wards.
Let's transition into the 1960s. So, in the 1960s, you can imagine the flaws regarding the hospitals back then. Wards back then were structured almost like in Kesey's novel. Large dormitories, long hallways, the same nurse stations, and day rooms, but way more overcrowding occurred in real life. People tried to shut down wards because they were starting to deteriorate and break down from the excessive overcrowding.
Yeah, on top of this, like the structures, it would cost a lot of money during the time, although not as much as today. In the 1960s, it would take approximately $2,600 to stay. Now it costs $5,700 to stay. Interesting how the margin has changed since then, perhaps regarding our dollar. Sean, could you transition into the true facts on treatment transitions from the 1960s?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Along with prices going up, our treatments have changed. Around the 1960s, they started switching from surgeries and shocks to to medications and to basically repair and balance the brain's chemistry instead of breaking it. They did a lot of ECT and lobotomies before. ECT's electroshock therapy, and lobotomies are basically where what do you guys think about lobotomies? I've always thought, like, who comes up with the idea of, oh, this man's brain's not working properly, let's cut a piece out?
Well, the way they thought about it in the beginning was to cut out the front or piece of the frontal lobe to make it so their handlers could have an easier time handling them, which is quite something, all right.
So they were trying to turn them into almost vegetables.
Yep, pretty much.
Well, you see, they were trying to change the kind of process of how their brain worked, and they were trying to get them to behave more human-like, I guess you could say. Like, they wanted you to kind of obey them and not be as aggressive. Say one acted out and they wanted to cut the aggressive habits. They wanted to kind of get rid of that aggressive tendency, and they believed that cutting off a piece of the frontal lobe in the brain was a good idea.
It's almost like extracting the bad parts in a way.
Except they take a little bit of the good ones too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you can't really be a disturbed person if you're almost like a zombie, eh?
There's no quite true absolute positive treatment for everything, right?
Yeah. So like I was saying, they did a lot less lobotomies and ECT, and they transitioned more into medications such as antidepressants, and we definitely saw a lot more uprising by patients in society in 1960. We saw a lot of patients were challenging doctors' authorities by requesting their files and fully understanding their medications before they took them. We saw one of the characters in the book also do this when he was taking his pills for his seizures, because they deteriorated his gums and made him lose his teeth, and he half the time he refused to take his pills because of this.
There's really no win-win value there.
Yeah. Anyways, let's now we're done talking about the 1960s and how it relates to Casey's view. Let's talk about how the actual 1960s and Casey's view relate to today's different topics. You want to talk about that, Tanner?
Yes. Some differences shared between the 1960s and current are our medical advancements and technology have grown far more superior than the ones used in the 1960s.
I sure hope so.
Yeah. Lobotomies are no longer used, whereas they were used very commonly in the 1960s. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is now treated with cognitive behavior therapy, also known as CBT, in which they identify how they are affecting your thoughts with help from a psychiatrist.
Interesting. Did you guys know that PTSD was actually not recognized until the year 1980, only when the third DSM was released? That's 2 whole books on all of psychology that didn't even recognize PTSD as a disorder.
That's insane.
Yeah, and during that time, people were treating PTSD as if it were a stressor, and the treatment for that actually caused stress, hopelessness, and sadness.
Wow.
It's kind of like being ignorant in a way, how being scientists, they didn't look at this, and how you could have like flashbacks. They thought it was just anxiety, which I think is insane.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Some of the issues that we've had with mental illness over the past years. It's definitely glad to live in this century right now.
Yeah. Wards now are also closer to current time. We're not as crowded as they were in the 1960s. Today, there are far more activities that benefit the patients, such as occupational support, creative outlets, structured days, diet and exercise, light therapy, and heavy support from family or relatives, whereas back then there wasn't as much
Mainly just
support.
isolation, and just you've got one nurse who you can talk to who may or may not actually care if you
and some family members would actually submit their other family members to the wards to get them treated because they didn't believe they were fit for society.
Wow. Do you want to talk about maybe the current relationships that are held between nurse and patients and how it differs from the 1960s?
Definitely, yeah, I'll get into that.
Great.
Currently, the relationship between the patient and the nurse is on personal terms while still maintaining a professional outlook. They want to make sure they understand each individual patient as they're all different. All their symptoms may be the same or it may be a little different, but even a slight alteration in symptoms can create a huge breakthrough in becoming...
Yeah, and how they treat them and how they respect them within the ward.
Yeah. Nurses are often regarded as custodians for the mentally ill and are not included in group meetings discussing institution policies, which I think is very different than what Ken Casey was saying in the book.
Really? Yeah. That's crazy, because in the book, Nurse Ratched was friends with the supervisor of the ward, and it seemed like she was making most of the decisions in there, right?
Yeah, she is no means an official either.
No, yeah. If she was a nurse today, she'd just be a custodian for patients. That's interesting. I believe that I think nurses should definitely be included on institution policy because they're the people who deal with the outside society as well as the patients. I think they're most important people to talk to, don't you guys?
Of course.
Yeah.
Let's get into maybe the cost of these nurses and how they incorporates into today and between the 1960s. So obviously the price now of maintaining psychiatric hospitals is much higher than it was in the 1960s. So basically the reason for this is in the 1960s we allowed overcrowding, and today that's just not all right. We used to have wards, like we said, Riverview had almost 5,000 patients at the height of its time in the 1960s, and that's just crazy. So because of this, we've taken, we need more space for more people. We also, like you said, we personalize the care for each patient. We make sure that everything that we do for them, it's not just a basic drug that we're giving out to people.
Yeah.
It's specific to their condition. If they're depressed, antidepressants. And nurses obviously get paid a lot more. Like our presenter said she got paid just over $19 an hour in the 1960s, and now she's getting paid almost $50.
That's quite a lot.
So it's definitely a huge movement up for the nurses of today.
Yeah, perhaps more like demand of them now.
I think that's mostly linked to before nursing wasn't seen as a higher education, but today many different programs are being taught, and it's really important because their research development is now encouraged because of it being a higher education.
I think that's great because it really pushes more nurses in the field, and we could really use more knowledge in mental illness today as it affects a huge portion of the population.
Yeah, I think that basically covers everything we need to today.
Anything else,
Thanks
guys?
for joining us, Tanner, Nick, and
Wherever Ruckley is.
Ruckley. I think he walked away.
Oh boy.
I wonder where he went.
Well,
I'll have to go find
Hopefully,
them.
Nurse Ratched doesn't get mad that we lost another patient.
see you next time.
See you later, guys.
Bye.